Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Retro Hardware. Thanks for all your comments. Today we're taking another one of your requests, the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn first came out in Japan on November 22nd, 1994, about 6 weeks before the Sony PlayStation launch. Over here in the US, we got the system about 6 months later in May of 1995. This is actually one of the US launch Saturn systems. You can actually still see the software, etc. Remember them? The price tag? The Sega Saturn, yep, it launched at $399, and Virtua Fighter was the packing game. And I think Virtua Fighter is a perfect example of all the woes that plagued the Sega Saturn. Everything about the Sega Saturn was rushed. Originally, the Sega Saturn was supposed to launch here in the US in September of 1995. However, at the first E3 Expo, Sega of America surprised everyone and announced that the Sega Saturn was going to be available immediately in May of 1995, 4 months ahead of schedule. Virtua Fighter should have never been the pack-in. It was an incredibly buggy port that didn't exactly show the system off. Conversely, Battle Arena Toshinden was one of the launch titles for Sony's PlayStation 1. It was also a 3D polygonal fighter, but that game seemed far more graphically superior than Virtua Fighter. In fact, it soon became clear that the Sony PlayStation 1 would be able to handle polygons far better than the Sega Saturn. Here's another comparison of Namco's Ridge Racer 1 on the PlayStation 1 with Sega's Daytona USA on the Saturn. Note the terrible redraw rates of the objects on the horizon in the Sega Saturn game. Part of the reason for the Saturn's difficulty in handling polygons was the fact that many companies found the Saturn very difficult to program for. This was partly due to the fact that the Saturn had a complex architecture in which it had not one but 2 CPUs. So in many ways it was very difficult to extract the most out of the Sega Saturn. Thankfully, later in the Saturn's life cycle, Sega released new graphic software libraries which made it a lot easier to program for the system. In fact, the port of Virtua Fighter 2 was a lot better than the first one. Enough about the system's shortcomings, let's talk about its strengths. It's a shame that the Sega Saturn came out during a time when 3D was becoming a new trend and 2D was slowly going out of style, because the Sega Saturn really excelled at 2D gaming. In Japan, Capcom fully supported the system, and you got great fighters like X-Men Children of the Atom, Vampire Savior, X-Men vs. Street Fighter, and Street Fighter Alpha 3. To play some of these awesome fighting games, you needed an extra RAM cartridge. These came in 1 and 4 megabyte configurations, and it would plug up in the cartridge slot of the Sega Saturn system. The Sega Saturn system itself is a CD-ROM based system, but for these fighting games, which had fairly large sprites, you needed an extra RAM cartridge because the stock Sega Saturn didn't have enough RAM. The Saturn definitely got better with respect to games released later in its life cycle. Some notable highlights included Nights into Dreams from Sonic Team. In fact, Nights came packaged with this new 3D controller which helped facilitate the new controls. The Sega Saturn was also home to the Panzer Dragoon series, which culminated in Panzer Dragoon Saga, a beautiful RPG, and it was also one of the last games released for the Sega Saturn here in the US. In addition to fighting games, the Sega Saturn was also home to many a great shooter, especially in Japan. Noted developer Treasure released Radiant Silvergun and the awesome side-scroller Guardian Heroes. Here in the US, unfortunately the Sega Saturn was in 3rd place behind Sony PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. However, in Japan, the Sega Saturn was a solid 2nd place behind Sony, while Nintendo 64 was in 3rd place. There were a whole bunch of great import titles that never saw the light of day here in the US. Unfortunately, the Sega Saturn is region coded, so you either need a mod chip or a converter cartridge if you want to play these import titles. If you do get a converter cartridge, make sure you get one with enough RAM so you can play those awesome 2D fighting games. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks again for watching. Keep up those comments. Happy collecting.